Well, welcome back, guys, on this Thursday for another lesson in Honors World Geography. We're going to kind of flip the scales a little bit now from where we've been, right? We've been talking a lot about outsourcing, right? And the global assembly line where industrial jobs have in a lot of ways been outsourced or sent away to countries where labor costs are a lot lower than they are here in the industrial core. But now we want to start talking about the flip side of that a little bit today. And what happens in countries like the United States when so many industrial jobs leave? And so the answer to that question in short term is basically deindustrialization and economic restructuring as we see the rise of newly industrialized countries coming up. As a result of advances in flexible production that we've talked about before, the post-Fordist approach, and in the global division of labor over the past 30 years, many old manufacturing regions have experienced deindustrialization, a process by which essentially companies move industrial jobs to other regions rather, leaving the newly deindustrialized region to work through a period of probably high unemployment and, if possible, hopefully, switch to a service economy. We'll talk more about service economies tomorrow and what can be done. At the same time, the places with lower labor costs, weak environmental laws, low tariffs, have become, in a lot of cases, the new industrial regions of the world. East Asia, in particular, has become an important new region of industrialization. Now, kind of circling back now to just kind of explain sort of the genesis here of deindustrialization and economic restructuring. In the mid-19th century, mid-1800s, the United States steel industry was concentrated around Pittsburgh, right? Hence the football team, right? The Pittsburgh Steelers, where iron ore and coal were both mined not so far away. Most large United States steel mills built during the first half of the 20th century were located not around Pittsburgh, but in the first half of the 20th century, more around communities near the east and west coasts, like Baltimore, like Los Angeles, like Trenton. These coastal locations partly reflected changes in transportation cost. Iron ore was increasingly coming from other countries. It was better to kind of get steel manufacturing happening near the actual like ports where they were being exported out, and so that was a thing for a while. It's not in the world that you live in now. Much more recently, many of the steel plants in the United States have closed. There are some survivors. Among the survivors, we do see steel plants around Southern Lake Michigan, kind of in the Chicago area, and also along the East Coast. Generally, a successful steel mill nowadays is going to be located near a major market. We call them mini mills. Mini mills are basically much of what the United States steel market is made out of now. They're less expensive than more traditional mills to build and operate, and they locate themselves near markets because their main input is actually scrap metal, which is widely available outside of major cities. So a lot of the steel manufacturing that we do in the United States now is basically turning scrap metal into steel instead of the old way of doing things. Just to kind of give you an idea of how much things have changed. So take a look at this map, right? This is a map of steel production in the world in 1980. And if you look carefully at it, you'll see that most of the steel production is happening in more developed countries. 80% of it, in fact, in 1980 was being done in developed countries and 20% in LDCs. But by 2010, look at the switch. Interesting. 1980? This map says 2005, but 2010 basically the same. You see the shift, right? Where by 2010 only 37% of steel is being produced in developed countries, 63% in LDCs, and you can probably tell from this map that China was most responsible for this increase, with India and South Korea also being somewhat responsible, but China big time. China's steel industry has grown in part because of its access to iron ore and coal. It has an abundance of both resources there. But the biggest deal with China is the exploding market for motor vehicles there. And so, because motor vehicles are a bulk gaining industry, you would want to have as much of that steel manufacturing happening in China as possible because you want to get close to the market for your finished product. So that's the thing. Overall, the northeastern United States and Great Lakes region of the U.S. Has lost about 6 million jobs in manufacturing between 1950 and 2010. Meanwhile, if you take a look at the map here, you'll notice that not all of these jobs were outsourced overseas. Manufacturing jobs have actually grown by about 2.5 million in the South and the West of the United States since the early 1950s. Industrial growth in the South, especially, has been stimulated by government policies such as right to work laws. What a right to work law basically is it requires a factory to maintain what's called a so-called open shop and prohibits a closed shop. So what that basically means is this: in a closed shop, a company and a union agree that everyone must join a union in order to work in the factory, a workers' union. By enacting right to work laws, southern states basically made it more difficult for unions to organize factory workers and for them to collect dues and bargain with employers. This becomes very, very attractive to companies that were, very much wanting to kind of keep unionization out of the picture altogether, and not wanting to have to bargain with unions to pay workers higher wages, right? So what right to work states basically kind of guarantee is lower cost labor, which is attractive to manufacturers, and so we've seen a lot of these jobs move south as a result. And so that's something to keep in mind. That said, though, so much of the industrial world has actually, for the most part, gone to other countries. For much of the 20th century, Japan was the only global economic power in East Asia. That picture began to change when we started seeing the rise of what we call NICs. NICs stands for newly industrialized countries. And it especially began to change with the rise of a group of those NICs that we call the Asian Tigers. We're talking here about South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. This growth largely taking place in the 1960s and in the 1970s. Benefiting from the shift of labor-intensive industries to areas with lower labor costs, government efforts to protect developing industry, and government investment in education and training, these countries emerged. These four Asian tigers really emerged as the first NICs, the first newly industrializing countries. South Korea probably did it better than anybody, developing manufacturing districts that exported products ranging from automobiles to calculators to computers. Essentially, here we're talking about the rise of Samsung and LG, right? Taiwan, as well, promoted high-tech industries, computers, telecommunication equipment, precision electronics, other high-tech, some Taiwanese brands that you might recognize. Acer, yeah, some of the maybe your cheaper laptops, right? The Acer brand are Taiwanese. HTC was a company that had a bit of a corner on the cell phone market with Droids for a little bit, although it's kind of faded out of the picture in recent years. I don't think it's been able to compete against Samsung quite the same. Hong Kong, as well, originally specialized in textiles and light manufacturers, later got involved in electrical equipment and appliances, other household products. Hong Kong is a major break of bulk point, and so that's another key to its success as well, because it attracts just so much shipping in and out. Singapore also very strategic geographic position, started out as a major what we call entrepot, ENTREPOT, sort of a global warehouse where merchandise can be imported or exported without paying for tariffs. And so that attracted a lot of business to Singapore originally. Now, Singapore is really into the high-tech sector, also It's a major quaternary sector for selling financial services around the globe. Yeah, so that's a thing. More recently, we can't have a talk about newly industrializing countries without talking about China. Originally in early communist China, China's industrial heartland was centered in the northeastern part of the country. But now the focus really has been more towards, if you look at this map here, the focus is really on Shanghai and that region between Shanghai. And if you go west out of Shanghai, all the way down the Yangtze River towards Wuhan. This region of China, especially, is kind of the pace setter for Chinese industrial growth. It was kind of the first area that we saw major iron and steel production. Now, railroad cars, ships, books, foods, chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. And special economic zones like Shenzhen, further south, have basically transformed cities and towns in China by attracting businesses, from all around the world. Of course, along with that comes a lot of pollution, but there it is. Interestingly enough, on August the 15th, 2010, about 10 years ago now, China officially surpassed Japan as the second largest economy in the world and the world's largest exporter. I mean, take a look at this visual here, right? You're looking at a photograph of Shanghai in 1970 on the top, and then below it, same location in Shanghai now, and you really see the explosive growth. You really, really do. Yeah, that said, China's economy still is very, very heavily dependent on exports and foreign investment. Um, there's probably some, potentially destabilizing social and environmental costs to China's rapid rise. Labor costs are growing there. China could be very vulnerable to some of the very forces that gave it an advantage over other countries not long ago in terms of the cheaper labor. We'll have to see, how COVID-19 affects the Chinese economy along with the rest of the world. There's a lot that still kind of remains to be seen there. There's some question marks, but China's growth is nonetheless spectacular. And then, along with China, the rest of what we call the BRIC countries or the BRICS countries, BRICS. B for Brazil, R for Russia, I for India, C for China, and S for South Africa. Because over the past decade, manufacturing has really surged in South and in Southeast Asia, in South Africa, and in Central and South America. And Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa in particular are increasingly grouped under the acronym BRICS because these are the countries that are sort of the evidence of this shift in global economic power away from the traditional economic core. And China is leading the way, but India is now the fifth largest economy in the world, with major industrial complexes around the cities of Calcutta and Mumbai and Chennai, and with a larger labor force or very large labor force and a growing middle class and a location really midway between Europe and the Pacific. India's economic influence is clearly on the rise. Brazil is currently the ninth largest economy in the world. Russia is currently the 12th. They're expected by 2050 to be the ninth or the sixth and seventh largest, respectively. South Africa was invited in 2010 to kind of join an alliance of these countries since it's the only industrial country in sub-Saharan Africa. And so we see sort of this changing industrial landscape for sure. And so, we basically kind of see a new reality, right, with these newly industrializing countries. Where does that leave, though, countries like, the United States, Canada, the countries of Western Europe, the countries like Japan, Australia, that largely now depend on the service sector? What does that growth look like in the 21st century? We'll take a look at that tomorrow. We're beginning to see with, some of the recent events that the service sector is highly dependent on global economic stability. We're definitely, seeing it put under a bit of a stress test right now. But we'll talk more tomorrow about what the emergence of a service sector looks like in North America and Western Europe and in Japan and Australia. Hopefully you guys are all doing well. Hopefully these lessons are helpful in kind of keeping you guys up to speed with where we're at. And you'll have some more kind of like GIS type activities again next week once we're kind of ready to finalize our discussions on industrialization and moving into urbanization for the final part of the unit.